All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome. On behalf of the Center for Research on the Wisconsin Economy and the Department of Economics, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you. My name is Anant. I'm a professor of economics at UW-Madison, where I hold the Mary Sue and Mike Shannon Distinguished Chair, and I'm also the director of the Center for Research on the Wisconsin Economy. We have a great speaker today. John did not believe it when I told him standing room only, already so at 5. Let me just take a quick minute to tell you a little bit about our center. It's housed within the economics department, and it's a market-based research center. Our objectives are for student engagement. We've written on a variety of topics, such as administrative rules and the REINS Act and the impact of that, the impact of tariffs on Wisconsin and the national economy and the world, the impact of tax cuts and regulatory reforms. We released a series of papers titled The Economics of UW-Madison. This was last year. So it's writing these papers and engaged with using the best available tools and bringing them to bear on state-of-the-art topics is something that we've done over the last few years or so. But a big component of what we do at the center is to bring in speakers such as John. And so I'm delighted to have a speaker on a very hot topic: inflation, government debt, and the future of the economy. At least that's the title I'd envisioned for John. Before I do that, some logistics. John will speak for about 40 minutes, 45 minutes or so. You have a QR code right here. If you were to try to get through this QR code, there will be a list of questions that are already entered. You can enter your own question. You can upvote and downvote a question. And I'll try to make sure I get through as many popular questions that I can at the 45-minute mark or so. So let me introduce John. John Cochrane is a Rosemary and Jack Anderson Senior Fellow of the Hoover Institution at Stanford. His academic publications center on monetary policy and asset pricing. John has written a series of papers on macroeconomics, health insurance, time series econometrics, financial regulation, and other topics. His most recent book, The Fiscal Theory of the Price Level, was released in January 2023, and he aims to tell us why Milton Friedman was wrong. Cochrane is a frequent opinion contributor to the Wall Street Journal and other publications and blogs as the Grumpy Economist. He's the past president and fellow of the American Finance Association and a fellow of the Econometric Society. The winner of numerous awards, they include the APEE Adam Smith Award, the TIA Kraft Institute Polly Samuelson Award, and the Bradley Prize in 2023. Before coming to Hoover, John was the AQR Capital Management Distinguished Service Professor of Finance at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. John earned his bachelor's degree at MIT and his PhD at University of California, Berkeley. Outside of academic pursuits, and I suspect this is why you left Chicago to go to Hoover, John is a competitive sailplane pilot and enjoys cycling, windsurfing, skiing, and other outdoor activities. Please join me in giving a warm Wisconsin welcome to John Cochrane.
Thanks for that warm introduction. My brother went to Madison, I didn't, but so he got the good choice, I think. He certainly enjoyed his time here. I'll pass that on. So let's talk about inflation. That's me. That's my life as the Grumpy Economist, drawing from my son, and the book that I'll talk about, Fiscal Theory of the Price Level. I'm always, academics come to advertise their books. That's, crisis cycle about inflation in the world. So let's talk about inflation. This is what just happened. In case you just crawled out from under a rock somewhere, in the last couple of years, we had big inflation in the US, something not seen since the 1970s. What happened? Starting in just about exactly February 2021, inflation broke out. Inflation rose from about 2% up to about 9%. In the meantime, the Federal Reserve did nothing. In an unprecedented lack of movement, the Fed did nothing for about a year. Inflation, however, eased off long before the Fed raised interest rates substantially, came back down again, and now is trundling along somewhat above the Fed's preferred 2%. And so there's a good question: are we headed for the soft landing, or are we going to stall this thing off the runway, or are tariffs going to come and send us all spiraling away again? And that's the kind of questions I want to think about. also more deeply, how can we avoid a repetition of this kind of event? What does this teach us about how inflation actually works? Now, of course, I think I have an answer to that question, which I won't hide from you. Why did inflation break out? This graph adds this line here, which is on the right-hand scale, national debt, 17 trillion. Over COVID, that rose to 22 trillion. Our government borrowed $2 trillion, printed $3 trillion, and wrote people checks, sent them out. What happens when you do that? They run out and try to spend the money, they send prices up, and you get inflation. That is not a surprise. And in fact, central to the argument is not only did they do that, but we've continued. There's another 6 trillion of printing and, well, mostly in this case, borrowing money and sending people checks that continued to this very day. So that didn't end after. That seems kind of obvious. Borrow, print money, send people checks, and you're going to get inflation. I do not want to imply that that was all bad. We had a huge economic and financial crisis and a pandemic. Government had to do something about it. We didn't want people dying in the gutter and businesses all closed. I think they vastly overdid it. I think they vastly overdid it because they're not crowing about how wonderful this all was. But less from the inflationary perspective, let's just say that's what happened without a good or bad and try to understand. Now, here I'm going to bring in some thinking from this fiscal theory, the price level, which is really underlies every theory of the economy that we have. So it's not particularly special. Let me tell you how I like to think about inflation, and you'll see it's fairly obvious. We economists love equations. So my favorite equation is up there. The real value of government debt is equal to the value of what people are going to get from the government debt. How is the government going to pay off its debt? The value of primary surpluses. That's taxes in excess of spending. The government repays.
Turn that off, Jim.
Someday, are we having trouble here? I'll just talk louder or faster. Repays its debt by charging taxes in excess of spending. And so that is the value of government debt. And the price level will adjust until that's true. Now, what does that mean? Inflation is always and everywhere too much money chasing too few goods. Milton Friedman was right about that one. So how much is too much? What can the government do about too much money chasing too few goods, as in fact we just saw? Well, the main thing it can do is it can soak up the extra money. The way the government soaks up money is by taking it from you, taxes, less giving it to you, spending. So soaking up the primary surplus is how the government soaks up money. That lowers inflation. Not enough of it, inflation is higher. Another way of thinking of it is that a government debt is like stock in the government. So if you own a stock and you discover that the company is not going to be,
I'm sorry.
This is going to make noise.
try to get rid of that stock, send the stock price down. Same is true of government debt. If we wake up and decide these jokers are never going to fix the deficit problem, let's get rid of our government debt. How do we do that? We go out and try to spend it, send up the price of goods and services. Now that perspective, which took me 630 pages of a book to say, and seems perfectly obvious to you, well, good things are perfectly obvious in life. It does hone your mind on what's important. It does not say that debt and deficits cause inflation. It says the debt and deficits cause inflation if people do not trust they will be repaid. It's the confidence in long-run repayment that keeps debt and deficits from causing inflation. Debt and deficits are good and great things. Yes, government debt is a wonderful thing. You'd be surprised someone from the Hoover Institution would say that, but I'm going to say it because it's true. Government debt, like student debt, allows the government to borrow to meet an emergency, not have to tax right away, to tax slowly over generations to pay it off. That's a great thing for the government to be able to do. So this pattern, deficit today, followed by small, steady primary surpluses to pay it off. That's a good and great thing. That doesn't change the total sum of the surpluses, no inflation. Inflation comes when there's debt and deficit and not a good plan for paying it back. Well, the plan for paying it back is crucial to whether debt and deficits cause inflation. That's the central insight that you have to think about when you want to think about an episode like this. Was it inflationary or not? Did people trust it will be paid back? That also points to a third possibility over here. Suppose people wake up and just lose faith without a debt or deficit today, then inflation can come seemingly from nowhere. And inflation often comes seemingly from nowhere, just as stock prices often decline seemingly from nowhere. Well, that's exactly what happens when people lose faith. Faith in that repayment is really up. With that insight in mind, let's go back and look at what just happened to us. Does that story make sense? Not just lots of debt, because we've had debt before, like 2008, without inflation. What about this time made people not trust the repayment? Well, when you look at the history of it, which I'm only going to do briefly now, but I'll send you the papers if you want to see longer versions, that's a plausible story. In the COVID era, not only did they print money and borrow money and send people checks, but they sent a lot of signals that we are not going to have normal repayment later. A great quote from our Treasury Secretary in January 2021, go big, interest costs are low, debt doesn't matter. The zeitgeist of 2020 was government debt doesn't matter. Interest rates are low, modern monetary theory, secular stagnation, don't worry about government debt. And in fact, the fact that the inflation came not during COVID with some of the spending, but when that turned into a permanent spigot of spending. The American Rescue Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, the most hilariously named act of Congress in all of American history. In Europe, they did the Next Gen EU, spigots of money being thrown out after COVID was over. This was not about COVID spending. This is where we're going on. That's the smoking gun in this field. Bottom line, the government gave people a lot of money in debt. They did not see this as a good savings vehicle to hold on to. They tried to spend it. They didn't have faith that this was a good thing to invest in. They went and spent it, and we got it. Now, I put an equation. You don't have to read the equations. This is a talk, but I want you to know the equations are there, because this is how we do economics. I'm just telling stories. It's easy to tell stories. Beware people that tell stories. It is important that there is a model. Models don't mean it's right. If you can't write down a model, it's almost certainly wrong. So I just put up the equations to let you know what I do as an economist is to write down a fully consistent little toy model of the economy that might be wrong, but at least it's internally consistent, and see how it describes this event. So that's the model I wrote down. If you know something about this stuff, you'll recognize the standard new Keynesian model enhanced with the government debt equation. If you don't like equations, you don't have to look at it. You just want to know there's something there. And that's how I computed this, which is a simulation from the model. I asked my little model, what happens if I dump $5 trillion of money in debt on people with no way of paying it back? And the model says, here's what happens. What happens is you get a spike of inflation, or measured year on year, the way we measured it, a year-long increase in inflation that then goes away on its own. And in this simulation, the Federal Reserve does nothing. I asked of the model, what if I dump money on people and the Federal Reserve does nothing? Answer, you get a surge of inflation, which goes away on its own without the Fed having to do anything. Why? Because it's a one-time gift of money. When you've driven the price level up and inflated away the government bonds, that goes away. So the price level rises, the inflation rate rises, and it goes away. By the way, immense confusion between price level and inflation rate. The inflation rate came and went away, and people said, oh, why are the peasants with pitchforks still mad? Because they understood the price level is higher than it used to be. So if you get one thing out of this, don't confuse the price level and the inflation rate. The inflation rate was transitory, the price level was not, and that's exactly what it is. What happens is inflation eats away the value of the debt. And that is a crucial part of the experience. If a government wants to spend and does not want to raise taxes, it's got to come from somewhere. Spend money, it either comes from current taxes, it comes from future taxes by issuing debt that you then pay back, or it comes out of the pockets of existing bondholders. You essentially default on the existing bonds. That's what we did to pay for the COVID spend. And to buttress that story, here is the primary surplus. So that's taxes minus spending, not including interest payments on the debt, divided by GDP. you can see what happens. In recessions, we go into deficit. As we go back to normal times, start thinking about paying off debts. In COVID, kaboom. That's the huge COVID shock, the huge COVID deficit.
It's easy.
We went back to normal levels of dysfunction. And an interest, I think, to me, a salient part of the story is that just as inflation ended, that's roughly when it became clear the 2022 midterms were going to go against the Democrats. Bernie Sanders was not going to get past $6 trillion of Green New Deal spending. We were going to go back to normal levels of dysfunction in Washington, which is where we are now, those primary deficits that are a little bit too negative. That didn't seem to bother anyone before, and it doesn't seem to be bothering people particularly. Buttressing up the story again, this is from a paper by Bob Barrow and Francesco Bianchi. They looked across countries on how much different countries spent on COVID as a fraction of GDP versus how much inflation they got. And the countries that did more of this fiscal spending got more inflation, countries that did less got less. So the fundamental shock of this inflation looks pretty clearly: dump a bunch of money on people, dump a bunch of money in debt without a clear plan to pay it away. You get inflation. If you don't want it to happen, do that again. Now, what about the Fed? Inflation, Fed. Does the Fed matter? Yes, the Fed matters, even in this fiscal theory. This is a same simulation for the model. Here I ask the question: what happens if interest rates go up and there is no change in fiscal policy? Those are the two instruments: fiscal policy, monetary policy. One is spend money, borrow money and spend it. The other one is raise or lower interest rates. So this is what if the Fed raises interest rates? And yes, the Fed, by raising interest rates, can lower inflation temporarily, though without fiscal help, that's going to cause a little more inflation in the long run. So it is still, even though I call it fiscal theory, the Fed matters. The Fed could have, and I think should have, raised, if it didn't want inflation, should have raised interest rates more promptly. That would have helped near-term inflation at the cost of a little long-term inflation, but that's a good thing to do. You want smooth inflation. You don't want volatile inflation. And this also accords with what we're seeing now. We are now living over here. Fed did raise rates that help bring inflation down faster, but leads to a persistent amount of inflation, slightly above 2%. So again, that makes sense too. So my summary about the event, and this is what we do in it. Look at history. That was history. We match it to models. Here's my model. What happens if there's a fiscal shock? Dump money and debt on people. You get inflation that goes away on its own. What happens if the Fed raises interest rates? That lowers inflation temporarily with a slightly higher inflation in the future. Boy, doesn't that look sort of like what we have. Now, what about all the other stories? Story number one, the one you hear is, oh, it was a supply shock. That's what the Fed says. Oh, it wasn't our fault. It was a supply shock. Think about supply shocks. Now, there were supply shocks in the pandemic. Pelotons, TVs, stuff like that you couldn't get through the ports that people wanted. Those prices went up. But that's a relative price shock. If you can't make enough TVs, then TVs go up and restaurant dinners go down. One price is higher relative to another. Inflation is the phenomenon of all prices going up and down together. So as you should not confuse the price level and the inflation rate, do not confuse relative prices with the common component of all prices and wages going up and down together. Something that makes Pelotons, energy, TVs more expensive than other things, that raises that price, but relative to other prices, that is not an explanation for why everything is going up together. And in fact, the level of everything is always set by fiscal and monetary policy. So a supply shock that is accommodated by demand. If there's a supply shock, the price of Pelotons goes up relative to restaurant dinners, and the Fed says, here, we'll give you the money so that you can afford the higher prices, then everything goes up. If it's not, then you just get a relative price change and no inflation. Supply shocks only inflation if fiscal and monetary policy accommodate them by giving you the money to do it. That too is considered, I'm not really on board with this, but it's standard to think of that as good policy. Because the Fed and other institutions think that prices going down is more hurtful than prices going up. So they would rather have everything go up than some go up and some go down. This is the standard story of the 1970s oil price shocks. Fed chose to accommodate them with more inflation so we wouldn't have a recession. But at least they could be honest about it and say that's what we did. So what about supply shocks? And all the other stories are about relative prices. Price gouging, monopoly, greed, all those other things are one relative to another. That's not value of money. Inflation is a decline in the value of money, period. It's not about prices. And that's another big. All supply shock arguments are supply shock caused the Fed and fiscal policy to accommodate. To say the supply shock caused the inflation is sort of like saying, well, Labley caused the supply shock. Supply shock causes fiscal and monetary policy. Fiscal and monetary policy causes the inflation. It's no more helpful to say the supply shock caused the inflation than to say the Labley caused the inflation. What matters is the horse, or in this case, the donkey. Here, I wrote out the stuff on the right to force myself to slow down and say it. Inflation that we had was a choice. It was not something that we didn't know what came from nowhere. It was a choice. Our governments, Europe too, lots of other countries, met COVID with the tools of war finance. This is something we've understood for centuries. What does a government do in a war? You spend like crazy and you don't worry a lot about the efficiency. You spend like crazy borrowing money and printing money. You hold interest rates down to make the interest cost of the central bank participates. You deliberately inflate so that the bondholders contribute just as well as the taxpayers. That's what's happened in every US war since and including 1776. What do governments do when they see supply shocks? Like, for example, huge big tariffs coming up. They do that by accommodating it with demand because they'd rather all prices go up than some go up and some go down, as in the 1970s. These are classic. I'm sure your undergraduate classes have talked about these things. These are just classic stories. Inflation is not a nebulous shock that couldn't control. And to the Fed says supply shock sort of in the same tone as the dog ate my homework. I don't know what the current excuse is, but that's not. It's a choice. Inflation was not a technical problem. The Fed is now engaged on a strategy review to decide whether it should change the adjectives from, oh, we're going to worry about persistent inflation to we're going to worry about somewhat more persistent inflation. I don't know, some gobbledygook in the strategy. No, it was a choice, and it was a hard choice. We will have crises again. We will have supply shocks. Our government in a crisis will be faced with are we going to meet this crisis with a river of money, potentially inflationary, or are we not and going to let the crisis be worse? That's a hard choice. There will be supply shock that we'll have to choose. Do we want some prices to go down or do we want all prices to go up? That will be a hard choice. If you don't want it to happen again, prepare to make better decisions, not the current excuses. And Washington is kind of stuck in nobody ever admits to making a mistake, which means you never learn from your mistake. There are big lessons from the inflation we just had. Your mentality about the macroeconomy, a lot of debates were completely won and lost in 2021. The previous 10 years, everyone was talking about demand, insufficient demand. All we need to do is to print more money, borrow more money, secular stagnation, boost demand like it's 1933 and Keynes is in charge. We did what you asked and we got inflation. That proved that our economy is right up against the supply constraints. If you want growth, you need supply, you need efficiency, you need productivity. You don't just need demand. So the future, not good. This is the CBO's projections of what's going to happen to the debt. And that rising ski slope doesn't look real good, does it? In fact, this is projections of the deficit. That doesn't look real good either. In fact, that's an optimistic projection because notice how the debt increased. Financial crisis, COVID, inflation ate away some of that. There will be more crises. So here's my forecast. Next crisis, crisis after that, we're still in this mode that the way the government handles every crisis is with a river of money. With that unreformed spending problem, how concretely is that going to cause? Number one, Suppose the Fed has to really do something serious to fight inflation, has to raise interest. Every time the Fed raises interest rates, that raises interest costs on the debt. And that means the Congress has to raise taxes or cut spending to pay those interest costs. And that's a big effect. We have 100% debt to GDP. 1% interest rate is 1% of GDP extra deficit that needs to be paid for. What if Congress says no? Every current macroeconomic model, you can't raise taxes or cut spending to pay the interest costs on the debt. Raising interest rates raises inflation. Fed may not be able to lower inflation with that fiscal situation. Worry two, even bigger, what about the next shock? For example, what happens when China invades or blockades Taiwan? It's going to be a massive supply shock. All trade, whatever trade is left after the tariffs get with it, is going to end. There's going to be a financial, a big financial catastrophe. What's the government going to want to do? Borrow $10 trillion, hand out checks, stimulate, bail everybody out, and this time military spending as well. Yet what are bond markets thinking? They're thinking, well, the last time you borrowed money from us, you inflated it away, and we came out, we lost 10% of the value of our portfolios. No, thank you. So that is, all crises need a spark, and the real problem of debt is our fragility, our lack of fiscal space. What do you do about it? Well, number one, sooner or later, Winston Churchill apparently did not say that Americans will always do the right thing after they've tried everything else. Sooner or later, after we've tried everything else, we've got to do the right thing and get the long-run fiscal situation of the country back to where it's been for 250 years. That in good times, we run small primary surpluses and slowly pay down our debts. People have confidence in that, and therefore they're willing to lend us money. Answer two, face what happened and prepare to make different choices. You do not want the next crisis to result in inflation quickly. You have to prepare to spend more wisely, not just throw money around like manure. And we have to prepare that markets want a clear repayment plan if they're going to lend us money without it being very. Now, I want to pivot a little bit to talk more generally about how do we think about inflation, in part because I'm speaking to a lot of people who are in an economics class that has theories of inflation. Where does inflation really come from? It's one of the great puzzles of economics, and one of the things that's driven me through my whole career. I've been wondering about this for 40 years. So here are the major theories. I'm going to try in 5 minutes to teach you every single theory of inflation we have, and tell them apart. One is what I just told you. Government debt more than what people think will be repaid. That's the key to it. Second is monetarism, the money supply. That's Milton Friedman's famous theory. And then the two flavors of Keynesian macro that float around. These are all of the existing theories of inflation that we have. We are lucky that recent history provides us about as clean a set of experiments as you could like to distinguish these theories of inflation. So what I'm going to hopefully amuse you with a little bit is what are these theories and how do they account or not account for recent history? Let's start with my friend Milton Friedman, who was 99% right about everything. And we're going to get the 1% where we can improve a little bit. This is the theory that inflation comes from too much money chasing too few goods, from too much money supply. Now, on a theoretical basis, this is a beautiful theory. It's logically consistent. Nothing wrong with it internally. The question is, does it apply to our world? It requires that central banks control the money supply. Our central bank sets an interest rate target. You can have all the money you want at that interest rate target. So the theoretical precondition isn't met. The heck with theory. Let's talk about the real world. Opposed to the joke of the University of Chicago is you always say, well, the heck with the real world. Now, how does it work in theory? But both of them. Now, in this experiment, I give you $5 trillion of money. Fiscal theory and monetarism agree. I give you $5 trillion of money. Money is just a form of government debt. If this were the Oprah show, and I give everybody a $1,000 check or $1,000 in cash, I can predict that the price of beer in the bars of Wisconsin, of Madison, is going to go up this afternoon. You guys are going to take $1,000. You're going to go out, right? So too much money is the same as too much government debt causes inflation. Here's the crucial difference between monetarism and the fiscal point of view. Suppose I give you $1,000, but I take back $1,000 of treasury bills. Assume you all had $1,000 of treasury bills sitting in your pockets. I give you money, I take back the treasury bills. Or better yet, you have a mutual fund that is backed by treasury bills. So you have to, I give you the cash and I take back your mutual. Now, what's going to happen to the price of beers in the bars of Wisconsin, Madison this afternoon? Nothing, right? Because I gave you money, but I took back the treasury bills. You're no better off than you used to be. For monetarists, it's exactly the same. The quantity of money increased, that should cause inflation. So, wouldn't it be nice if someone ran an experiment? First, let's give the US economy $5 trillion in new cash. Watch what happens. Second, let's give them $5 trillion in cash and take back $5 trillion in treasuries and see what happened. Our government just did that. Thank you. A wonderful, as clean an experiment as you get in economics. During COVID, as I showed you, they gave us $5 trillion. We got inflation. Previously, this is a plot of quantitative easing. During the quantitative easing period, the Federal Reserve gave $5 trillion in new cash and took back $5 trillion of treasuries. The result on inflation was nothing, nada, zero, zip, quiet. No inflation for that one, 10% inflation when we just gave you the money. Can you ask for a better experiment? I love you, Milton. We're wrong. And understandably wrong. No one had ever done this before. Most of Friedman's episodes were times when governments printed money to finance deficits. There was no way to tell the two views. That's the answer to your question. How do I differ from Milton Friedman? I kind of knew the question was coming. Now let me tell you about Keynesian economics. How does that work? Keynesian economics thinks about an interest rate target, not the money supply. And there's two versions. One is the newspaper version, the Federal Reserve version. Higher interest rates, lower demand, lower employment, and that through some sort of Phillips curve magic lowers inflation. Now, the key to this old Keynesian idea is that inflation is inherently unstable. If the Fed were to just hold the interest rate constant and never do anything with it, inflation would spiral up or deflation would spiral down. Think about deflation. Suppose the Fed hits the interest rate, deflation breaks out. Now the real interest rate minus inflation is higher. That lowers aggregate demand, that lowers output, that lowers inflation and pushes inflation down. Thinking. In that theory, the Fed has an important job. It's like a seal holding the nose on its bone, the ball on its nose. Inflation breaks out. The Fed has to quickly get the interest rate under inflation, to restabilize. Well, that has some theory complaints, but let's focus on the facts. This theory makes a clear prediction. If interest rates are stuck, then there will be an inflation or deflation spiral. It will spiral out of control. And in fact, that's what everyone was worried about when interest rates hit zero in 2000. New Keynesian economics, you're going to think I'm nuts, but this is actually how all current economic models work.
Really?
It's a very different view. So it's still interest rates and inflation. The problem is different. So in this theory, it's rational expectations. The only thing we did is make people smart about thinking about how they expect inflation in the future. In this theory, here's the interest rate, here's inflation. Inflation is stable. Inflation will eventually converge to where the interest rate goes. That makes a lot of sense. If the economy is inherently unstable, kind of doesn't make a lot of sense. This one makes a lot of sense. For the reason that if you're driving down the road and looking forward, you tend not to run into things. If you're driving down the road looking backward, you tend to spiral away. So forward-looking expectations lead to stability. Problem in new Keynesian economics is that although inflation is stable and will eventually go away on its own if the Fed does nothing, as we just saw, there are multiple equilibria. The economy, it can't fully determine inflation. There's a missing equation somewhere. There's one missing consideration. So in new Keynesian economics, the job of the Federal Reserve, get this, not to stabilize the economy, is to intentionally destabilize the economy. If the Fed wants this to happen, the Fed commits that should inflation come out differently from what it wants, it will deliberately hyperinflate or hyperdeflate the economy to force everybody to jump to the one equilibrium place. I did my best. If that doesn't make any sense to you, good luck. I don't think it makes any sense either, which is I'm criticizing. But let's get to facts. This makes a prediction. If you get to a moment that the interest rate is totally stuck, then inflation will bat around. It will bat around between these multiple opportunities. Fiscal theory is the same as New Keynesian economics, but we just have one possible value. That's the value where value of government debt is equal to the present value of future surplus. How are we going to tell these apart? Three theories, a theorem actually that says they're very hard to tell apart. Well, wouldn't it be lovely? The government would just hold interest rates constant for a while and let us see, does inflation or deflation spiral away? Does inflation or deflation bat around between multiple equilibria? Or does it just kind of sit somewhere near the interest rate and nothing much happens? Thank you. We just did this experiment. We had what's known as the zero bound era. Interest rates after the financial crisis went down to zero and stuck at zero. Deflation started to break out. And lots of op-ed writers said, oh, here comes the dreaded deflation spiral. We have to do something, here comes the Great Depression again. It didn't happen. Inflation just batted around 2%, as quiet as it's ever been, quieter than when the Fed was busy moving the levers. Just inflation did nothing for 10 years. Same pattern. Here's Europe, 14 years. Interest rates at zero. What happened to inflation? Multiple equilibrium volatility? No. Deflation spirals? No. Japan, 30 years.
30 years.
Japan spent 30 years with interest rates zero. What happened to inflation? Absolutely nothing. In fact, I'm going to say something that may sound outrageous, but I think it's true. Japan had the most ideal monetary policy anyone's ever seen. 30 years, no inflation, interest rates at zero, easy to borrow money. That's as good as it comes. Now, Japan's growth has been terrible, but that's because Japan, first of all, has microeconomic problems, and second, doesn't have babies. So those are problems. Central banks do all sorts of things, but they can't get people to have babies. And they also can't cure microeconomic. So this is big news. Nobody knew this in 2008. We have a decisive experiment. There's only one theory that accounts for this, and that's my friend the fiscal theory. This is also big news. We did not know before 2008 whether you could just have zero interest rates and sit for 30 years with no inflation or not. Turned out we can, and that really fundamentally changes the view.
Did you give away too much?
That leaves us with a big puzzle. And this is my work now, and those of you who want to go on to either graduate school or in graduate school and want thesis topics, we're at a funny stage of what appears to be a very mature field where there's elephants in the room we don't understand. The elephant in the room we don't understand is, can the Fed, by raising interest rates, lower inflation? You would think that was known, it is in fact not known, because we don't have a decent model of it. What we've just learned is that inflation is obviously stable. If the interest rate goes up, in the long run, inflation must go up. We don't, and that's just a consequence of stability. If it's a stable system, you raise the interest rate, inflation eventually goes up. Is there some way that in the short run, inflation could go down in response to this effect? That's what everyone believes this story. They don't really, the Fed doesn't really observe the long run, so they think about the long run. So you need some story where higher interest rates produce lower inflation in the short run. That remains, believe it or not, a research challenge. That's what I'm working on right now. And if you guys want, where's the PhD students? Topics wide open. It's a funny that we're at this moment of sort of a self-satisfied business with this huge elephant. I think of it as sort of 1890s physics. In 1890, I forget which one, a famous physicist was told, don't go into this business because all the big questions have been answered. And 1890 was, of course, just on the cusp of relativity and quantum mechanics. all the questions have been answered except these little details about the photoelectric effect and fast moving particles. And well, we'll get to that soon. Well, we're, I think, at a similar moment because we have 35 years of this basic Keynesian model that I showed you, but we do not have a model in which that happens. So either the policy belief could be wrong. It could be that the Fed really can't lower inflation all on its own, or there's some aspect of economics we don't understand that lets that happen. If you were living in a comfortable world that everybody knows how it works, I got news for you. Nobody knows how it works, not even the Fed. And as evidenced by the fact, the words that say we know how it works and the equations are diametrically opposed because the equations say that and the words. So I have lots more history to show you, which I'm not going to show you because we're out of time. Let's see what's the movie version of this that I want to show you. I will just close, I think, with this little bit of history. Inflation is fun because it's not obvious where it comes from. You go to the store and the price of bread is higher, and you say, "Oh, why are you raising prices?" And the baker says, "Well, that's, I'm the wholesaler raised prices." The wholesaler, "Why are you raising prices?" "Well, the farmer's raising prices." The farmer, "Why are you raising prices?" "Have you seen the cost of feed and horses these days? That goes up." "Why are you raising prices?" And they go, "Well, have you seen the price of bread?" So a journalistic approach will never get to it. So if it was too much money or too much government debt, that's hard to see. You need to understand. This is Emperor Diocletian, who had an inflation in the year 300. The cause of his inflation should look familiar to you based on what I just showed you. He was a Roman emperor. Here's what you do as a Roman emperor. Pay the army. If you don't pay the army, your life as a Roman emperor and your life period is not going to last very long. You pay the army. But he had a lot of soldiers and he didn't have any money. So what did he do? He devalued the coins. He put less gold in the coins and paid the army. Well, he lasted as emperor, but you know what happened? Too much government debt, not backed by surpluses. He got a big inflation. What did he do about it? The third thing that all governments do, he passed price controls. And this is a list of Emperor Diocletian's price controls. If you're into history, it's fun to look at. The price of a first quality amphora of wine delivered at the port of Rome shall be no more than 3 sestertii. Very detailed price control. It worked, and why he thought he got inflation was because of price gouging, hoarders, middlemen, greed, monopoly, a list of usual suspects that came out again only a couple of years ago. So, the more it changes, the more it stays the same. A sad part of economics is the durability of bad ideas into this very day. So this has been an ad. If you're interested in this stuff, this is the Adam Smith quote. All good economics, there's an Adam Smith quote. That's the Adam Smith quote that explains how fiscal policy is ultimately responsible for inflation. These are my books. I have a website with some, you don't have to read a whole 600-page book. There's some nice light essays that describe what I talked to you about today. I have too much questions. Okay, with that, I will stop and we'll have some questions.
John, thank you very much.
No one hear questions? Yeah, I sort of see it.
I'm kind of going to go through questions on the basis of popular demand. Not shockingly, the first one. What do you think will be the impact of Trump tariffs on inflation?
So, reminder, are tariffs an inflationary shock or a relative price shock? Are they a shock to the price level or to relative prices? Relative prices, right? They make the price of imported goods go up relative to domestic goods. So by themselves, tariffs are not the proper definition of the term inflationary because they don't reduce the value of your money. They raise the price of one thing relative to something else. It could be imported goods go up, domestic goods go, or it could be domestic goods go down in wages. Now, typically prices are a little sticky. So what's going to happen is the prices are going to go up and we're going to measure inflation because those imported prices go up, domestic prices stay where they are. You're going to get some measured inflation. But again, distinguish price level and inflation rate. That's a one-time shock to the price level. So you'll see inflation measured go up and then stabilize. Unless, depending on how does the Fed accommodate it. The Fed could say, we're not letting this happen. We're going to raise interest rates and make sure the price of everything else goes down. Or the Fed and Treasury could say, here's the money so you can pay the higher prices. I'm betting on accommodation. So I think it will result in inflation because I think the government will choose to do exactly what it did with the last supply shock, is to accommodate the supply shock and let the prices of things go up. So a bout of inflation. But don't be mad if you don't like tariffs. Inflation is number 5 on the list of reasons not to like tariffs. Microeconomics always trumps macro. So tariffs are a distortion. They mean we're going to do things more inefficiently, and it's going to lower the total productive capacity of the economy. So that's the real reason to the economic cost of tariffs. So those who like tariffs, of which you may have some, you need some benefit to match that microeconomic cost, which is the central.
A follow-up on the impact of tariffs. Do you think these policies could lead the Fed to hold off on rate cuts this year, which your astrology hat on?
Well, that's going to be very difficult for the Fed. Right? Usually the Fed will, I think the Fed learned its lesson. I think the Fed, I think now regards quietly, Fed regards this as a big mistake, not raising inflation promptly when interest, not raising interest rates promptly. So in normal times, they would do that. They would raise it. But on the other hand, they're facing a supply shock, just like they did last time. They're going to face huge political pressure not to raise interest rates. They're going to be worried that if they raise interest rates, the banks are all going to go under. They're going to be worried that if they raise interest rates, you know what Trump's raise interest rates. So they may, in fact, not react very quickly, which we think. That wasn't your question. You have to ask it again.
No, that was. You mentioned that confidence in paying off debt is key to preventing inflation or keeping inflation in check. What does that look like decades from now, going to projections of a future rapidly increasing debt to GDP ratio?
Those projections. Here's the CBO projection. Talking about this graph here. This will not happen. CBO says this will not happen. This is unsustainable. You can't keep borrowing money forever and ever. The only question is, when does it end? How does it end? I hope that ends with the US having a bipartisan moment and saying, let's get back to normal and recalibrate, stop spending, throwing money down rat holes, and money as if taxpayers actually have to pay for it, which they do, which is not that hard. It largely involves tax reform, spending reform. It's not a question of throw grandma off the back of the train versus kill the economy. Enough complete craziness in the system that we can do it. That's what I hope. If we get to a crisis, then we'll have to do all that stuff really fast rather than slowly and deliberately. That would be unfortunate if we get to that point. I just hope that this is not an external problem, this self-inflicted wound. In this, the greatest country on earth, are we really going to have a Latin American debt crisis? Because we can't sit around and do the kind of simple reforms that this group could get done in an hour. I hope that's not the way.
What would be your strategies to rein in the debt to GDP ratio? Do you have a particular threshold in mind that you think we ought not to cross? And do you think Doge can have an impact on the debt to GDP ratio?
Doge. I knew the Doge question was coming as well as the tariff question. The strategy is not as so needs reform. First of all, debt doesn't really matter per se. It's debt relative to your ability to repay that debt. That, of course, also depends. In fact, the debt is not really the problem. The problem is the spending. Suppose that the US were to simply default. Argentina does. We're not paying it. Tough luck. Oh, boom, debt gone. Well, let's inflate it away tomorrow. You know, huge hyperinflation, debt gone. That's lovely. Wait a minute. You still want to borrow 5% of GDP every year. to make spending promises, unlike your taxes. And now no one's going to lend you money again. The
Right.
problem is the spending, not the debt. We got to get the spending under control and got the taxes under control. And that's a question of reform. So economics teaches you about incentives. Oh, what you want out of your tax code is to raise lots of tax revenue at low tax rate. Here's another one. People just talk about raising taxes or cutting taxes. Once you're an economist, you should never use those words. You should distinguish tax rate, tax revenue. Now, how do you do this magic of raising lots of tax revenue at low tax rates? Answer, broaden the base. So sooner or later, we get rid of the Swiss cheese of exclusions and deductions. I mean, we have the exact opposite, very high tax rates, distortions, disincentives, and not much tax revenue. Be in charge, we would throw out the income tax, estate tax, corporate tax. We'd have a simple flat value added tax on everything. Federal government wants 20% of GDP, 20% sales tax and everything takes care of it. Done. That raises revenue with no economics. Similarly, spending is driven by two things, rat holes and social programs. So rat holes, I come from California, the land of the $100 billion high-speed train, which will connect Fresno to Bakersfield to fine metropolises, regular service starting in 50 years at a cost of about $200 billion. That kind of stuff, guys. And the big problem is the social programs, but there too, I think there's a squaring the circle on getting the incentives right. Biggest problem with social programs, the biggest unheralded problem is not the cost, it's the disincentives. Americans who earn below about $60,000 a year, once they get involved in 2 or 3 social programs, if they earn an extra dollar, lose $1 worth of benefits. People are smart. They understand what to do if you take away $1 worth of benefits if you earn an extra dollar. I think reform of these, reform and simplification of the programs is a way of squaring the circle beyond we need austerity. No, you heartless moron. You're going to sink the country. No, you're going to kill all the poor people. No, let's get out of this. There's plenty of room making this stuff work. Doge. Doge is not primary. Don't view Doge right now as a serious budget cutting because we got trillions to go and they're not authorized to reform Social Security. Congress has got to cut spending. They're being very effective, though, at showing multiple ways of the rot in Washington and how we got to this mess. Even though the total numbers are small, I think it's been a very useful exercise to wake people like us up to how our money is being misspent. And small amounts of money that are doing tremendous damage to our national interest are also worth cutting just because
Drink the Kool-Aid.
Next 2 questions are in Japan. How does your theory reconcile with periods or countries with high levels of government debt but low inflation? Like Japan, the national debt to GDP ratio is 140%, but inflation is almost 0. And what stops the US from holding 0% interest rates to get to a 0% inflation rate like Japan?
The Japan question. So Japan has a lot of debt. And, we've been worrying about Japan for a long time. Now, again, it's debt versus ability to repay. I think it's not totally unsensible that Japan has all this debt.
Is it cooler now?
That's my way out. Well, people seem to have confidence that sooner or later they'll repay the debt. How? Good question. One of the biggest answers is, of course, Japan also has very low interest rates. And so large levels of debt, you have sort of an unstable situation. If you are paying negative 1% interest, as Japan has been, as we have been for a long time, then debt is, you can make the interest payments. All of you can afford 150% of your income as debt if the credit card company charges you negative 1% interest rate every year. The low interest costs are fine, but then when the interest rates go up, now the trouble hits.
No.
Japan is vulnerable to high interest rates in the winter past, and they just haven't faced that. Japan also, their debt is long-term debt. We have short-term debt, which means long-term debt means when interest rates go up, it doesn't feed into the budget quickly. Japan's debt's held by old Japanese people. US debt is short-term held by Chinese central bank. Very different customer.
Awesome.
And even if Japan has some mystical thing, don't think that applies to you. Argentina has currency crises at 40% debt to GDP ratio. Bill has currency crises at 20% debt to GDP ratio. Italy has regular crises. They're about 140, 150%. They can't just say, oh, treat us like Japanese people, give us another 50% of GDP and don't charge us interest rates. Japan is the one exception in the 1,000-year history of beware sovereign debt because it tends not to get paid off.
Mentioned that while inflation did
Just
ease after the one-time payments, price levels continue to increase. Why aren't they positively correlated? That is, why did price levels continue to?
Oh, well, we don't have to argue about this. We can look at, so inflation, price level is, where's the number? The price, there's inflation. Price level is, inflation is just the first derivative of the price level. So inflation is 3% a year, the price level is going up 3% a year. That's where we are. But what more do you need to know? But why do we have inflation still at 3% a year? Well, the Fed wants 2% a year inflation. Why is another question. If I were in charge of the Fed, I like zero inflation. I like a steady price level. It seems to have this 2% target. So that accounts for why we have 2% of inflation a year, and we haven't quite gotten back there. And can you expand on the question other than what's the difference between the level and first derivative?
I think you covered it.
Okay, thank you.
Something totally different. What are your thoughts on the gold card?
On the what?
$5 million gold card.
Oh, immigration. Okay. Oh, we're going to get it.
And will it help solve our debt obligations? So the answer is no.
Well, I don't know if I can do math standing up. We have a $5 million gold card here. You got a calculator. 5 million gold card. We've got 2 trillion a year of deficit. How many of those we gotta do? I don't think there's enough money in the world for that. However, the larger question is immigration. The U.S. should want immigrants. We should want economic immigrants, people who come, work, pay taxes, and solve problem. This problem, more immigrants would be a great way if they come and pay taxes. Right. A great way. And we got a bankrupt government. There's people lining up at the doors to come in. I think 5 million is too much. I'd charge them, 50 grand at the border and I promise not to use social services and come on, work and pay taxes and bail out Social Security would be wonderful. Oh, to be fair to the administration, they are clear that they want more high-skilled, more economically productive immigration as well as not more. I just think 5 million is too much, and it gets you people who are going to bring their wealth here as opposed to people. That's a minor. Anyway, don't count it. The numbers are huge. So did anyone divide $1 trillion by 5 million for me?
Did we not see a slowdown in economic activity in 22 and 23 when the Fed raised interest rates? If the economy did not slow down, does it mean that the Fed monetary policy was ineffective?
Well, there's a good question. Let's see, do I have a graph here? Real puzzle is the opposite one. When the Fed started raising nominal, okay, we did price level versus inflation rate. We did relative prices versus price level. Now we're going to do real interest rate versus nominal interest rate. If you learn nothing else from economics, you will have gotten a lot out of that. The Fed started raising interest rates, but inflation is 9%. Now a 2% interest rate with 9% inflation is a negative 7% real interest rate. The puzzle is, why did inflation not spiral totally out of control with negative 7 and 8% real interest rates? This proves to you that standard Keynesian economics is wrong because it didn't. So really the puzzle is in the opposite direction. Fed was only bringing interest rates back up to roughly where they need to be given inflation. But it is true that the most widely forecast recession of the world never happened. And that another thing we don't know a lot about is, why are there recessions and why are there not recessions? Usually, I'll tell you my unscientific view of this: a recession needs a spark, and usually something financially bad has to happen. And that anyway, we did not have a sustained period of high real interest rates. You want to see high interest rates in recessions, you got to look at the history. I didn't.
Where?
Here's the 1970s and 1980s. I want to think about inflation. In the 1970s, we had three huge waves of inflation. Notice, by the way, that the interest rates rose very quickly. Not even the evil Fed of the 1970s sat on its hands for a year. But then 1980, we had interest rates huge, 4 and 5 percentage points above inflation for a decade. Now we're talking about high real interest rates, which were associated with big recessions. We had nothing like that this time.
We're at the end, so I just want to say thank you, John, for making the trip down here on behalf of everyone here. Thanks for
Thank
making
you
the
all.
trip and
This is a great
for
pleasure.
engaging with me.
6 o'clock. They cut it off.
We'll have a reception right outside with nachos, which didn't induce my students to come last time, but thanks for coming today.